In Africa, natural resources are in abundance. In 2008 alone, the continent unearthed 483 tons of gold, making up 22% of the world's total production. Even more impressive were diamonds, where Africa produced 55% of the world's supply in the same year, not to mention some of Africa's other mining and drilling industries, including uranium, platinum, nickel, bauxite, and cobalt. Africa's climate has also made them an agricultural powerhouse, employing 2/3 of the continent's working population and contributing 20 to 60% of each country's GDP. Africa's Great Lakes also contain 3,000 fish species and account for 2/3 of production. Organizations like the UN have predicted that West, East, Central, and Southern Africa are expected to reach a combined GDP of $29 trillion by 2050. This, as well as the 1.3 billion population at the ready in 54 countries, is beginning to coalesce in a big way. These facts, as you'll soon see, have not gone unnoticed by the rest of the world, particularly the US and China. As you can probably guess, the story of Africa is one wrought with foreign intervention, where outside powers have fought for control and influence of Africa's abundant resources. From the time of the Romans to the Cold War proxy fights against communism, and even today with China's attempts to profit from Africa's resources in a new way. Today, you'll see how China is slowly taking over Africa, and what, if anything, can be done. As mentioned, foreign incursions into Africa are not new to our modern day, and as is often the case with early geopolitics, all roads lead to Rome. The earliest signs of colonization only took place in the form of northern settlements such as Sabratha, Ea, and Leptis Magna. Most historical accounts agree that Africa had a sophisticated trade network prior to Greco-Roman involvement, which encouraged the state to avoid costly expeditions, at least in the earlier settlement periods. Most of Roman success at the time hinged on the relationship they had with Egypt. After the death of Cleopatra VII, nothing stood in the way of creating their greatest African monopoly. Using the Ptolemaic networks, established from the legendary conquest of Alexander the Great, trade with Africa via the Red Sea really kicked off in 30 BCE. Many merchants were trading almost year-round, as the weather conditions for even small ships were ideal outside of a small gap between October and December. One of the first notable trading hubs was a Nubian outpost south of Egypt titled Ptolemais Theron. The Greeks did the hard work of building relations with the local tribes, who, after a series of diplomatic trials, began opening their fertile lands to neighboring powers. The power known for controlling this station was known as Axum, located in modern-day Ethiopia, just 340 miles south of the prized checkpoint. During the time of Augustus, Axum served as the primary juncture for the transportation of luxury items such as labor, ivory, turtle shells, and rhinoceros horn. Over the course of the 1st century CE, these materials would adorn the furniture and walls of the wealthy, used as a looming status symbol during important meetings and festivals. This is where Rome would set up another notable stronghold, Didyros Island, which quickly moved to Aurigny once raiding made the former far too costly to remain active. For most of Rome's involvement on the African continent, this is the way business was carried out. Sailing was not only cheaper, but faster, making trips such as the trek between Theron and Axum's capital take only 5 days to complete. Although coastal checkpoints made up the majority of Rome's presence, this didn't prevent the world's largest empire from exploring Africa's interior. There were 5 great expeditions between 19 BCE and 90 CE, where Rome's finest felt compelled to explore more southern territories after putting a stop to trade interference from the peoples of Garamantes. Although many debate how deep legions traveled, coins found in regions such as modern-day Senegal suggest that generals reached deep into the heart of Africa. A number of notable military campaigns helped stabilize relations between Rome and leading tribes, but a series of eastern quarrels, as well as political motivations over the course of the 1st century, deterred the Romans from plunging deeper into the mysterious landmass. Because of this, Rome's impact on Africa will most likely forever be a subject fraught with speculation, but there's no doubt that the treasures extracted from the northern coastline were, by no exaggeration, worth dying for in the eyes of the developing world. As stated, the tendrils of Greece and Rome only reached as far as northern Africa. So when did more foreign powers begin their incursion into African lands? While for the most part, everything south of the aforementioned settlements remained life-threatening and mysterious until the 15th century, when the Kingdom of Portugal made the first strides with the help of Henry the Navigator. Son of King Dom John I of Portugal, Henry, or Dom Henrique, is identified as the key initiator of the Age of Discovery, finding new trade routes in the Atlantic, as well as pushing for the settlements to be established along Africa's western coast. He was fascinated by the cultures he encountered, so much so that the state identified him as the patron saint of exploration. Although his involvement was impactful, the following 16th and 17th centuries revealed very little about the continent's interior, as many believed these ventures to be too costly in the wake of constant conflict in Europe itself. This by no means prevented Portugal, as well as other powers, from asserting its dominance over what had already been discovered. After all, by this time, the slave market was in full effect. They allied with warlords in order to destabilize kingdoms, eventually forming lasting relationships with people like the militarist Lunda, who became key suppliers of forced labor by the 1800s. It wasn't until the 19th century that European nations became determined to stake a claim over African lands. The massive conquest would come to be known as the Scramble for Africa, where 7 of the greatest Western powers initiated new imperialism, increasing control over Africa by 90% between 1870 and 1914. The nations of Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Italy had all but decimated the network of kingdoms throughout the entirety of Africa. Portugal had undoubtedly laid the foundation for future involvement, but mismanagement of funds resulted in the kingdom taking a back seat when the real colonial growth began. Britain took control of almost 30% of the African population, a massive line of colonies dwarfing the original length of the Roman presence, only inhibited by the Germans, who reigned over 9%, including the colony of Tanzania. France came in second with 15%. Nigeria became a crown jewel for the growing British Empire, with 15 million subjects now serving under the Union Jack. All of this is not to say that the peoples of Africa surrendered without resistance. Far from it. One such case, and perhaps the most memorable, would be the battles of Zululand. For a time, the Zulus sat as the most important power in southeastern Africa. The resistance culminated in the legendary Anglo-Zulu War, where tactical mistakes were made by figures such as Lord Chelmsford, who had initially been quoted as saying, quote, "The Zulus must be thoroughly crushed to make them believe in our superiority. I shall show them how hopelessly inferior they are to us in fighting power." Trained by Shaka in the early 19th century, armed with iron-tipped spears and weathered shields, the Zulu had become the most brilliant military strategists among the native clans. Their Horns of the Bull battle formation proved to be a devastating pincer movement for their neighbors. Under a solar eclipse, 25,000 Zulu warriors would use these ancient tactics to take 1,300 British lives. Victories such as these would continue to bolster the might of the resistance, but the kidnapping of King Cetshwayo after the British victory in Ulundi, the Zulu capital, would bring an end to the tribal confederation, leaving them a cluster of warring lands, incapable of joining once more to fight the relentless wave of colonialism. The colonial rule would never prove to be completely stable, but it was stable enough for white settlers to call portions of Africa their generational home. Up until the 1960s, European legislative assemblies would dispute the validity of their prolonged involvement on the continent. Across the pond, there was a growing power that marched to the beat of its own drum, playing by different rules, creating its own history with Africa in a way that has proved devastating, complex, and extremely profitable. Before we take a look at Chinese relationships across Africa, let's first take a look at the relationship with the US. The relations between the US and Africa date back to the time of the Spanish, French, and British colonies. From the 1500s onward, the African presence was felt in North, Central, and South America in the form of hired soldiers, interpreters, and notably, slaves. When the United States began forming an identity of its own in the late 18th century, more and more territorial acquisitions presented complications. The British relationship with Africans and the slavery system established was different from what was seen in regions owned by France and Spain. For example, Florida was a Spanish haven for escaped slaves up until its acquisition in 1822. Records state that there were even joint efforts by the oppressed to defend newfound rights. The African Americans and Indians formed an alliance that would defend each other, a situation that led to a series of brutal wars between the United States and the Seminole and their allies. The Seminole tended to marry within their groups, so the different communities remained distinct. Although the act of trading slaves was congressionally illegalized in 1808, this didn't prevent the growth of the industry, at least not immediately. Take Charleston County, South Carolina, for example. In 1840, the slave population reached its peak of nearly 59,000 people. By 1860, there were 37,000 enslaved people, just 63% as many slaves as 2 decades earlier. Although there were other elements in African affairs domestically in the US, the brutality of slavery, rightfully so, eclipses everything else. Now, unsurprisingly, US-African relationships in the States were actually quite different from what was seen abroad. This isn't to say that it was universally positive, but it was a mixed tapestry that deserves analysis. There's the case of Morocco, which had become the first governmental entity to recognize US independence on December 20th, 1777. The US maintains cordial relations with other states such as Kenya and Ethiopia, giving economic aid throughout the 20th century. There's also Liberia, a state established with congressional funding in 1819. Ties between the slave export project turned nation-state resulted in its official recognition in 1862 under Lincoln. It has since become a controversial tax haven for major US and European corporations. The Cold War is where things grew to be rather complicated. Between 1961 and 1993, the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union began vying for influence over various regions in South Africa, primarily Angola, Zambia, Tanzania, Namibia, Mozambique, Rhodesia, and the Republic of South Africa. Each administrative shift, from Kennedy to Carter to Bush Sr., focused on problems ranging from humanitarianism to tactical warfare in what they believed was one of the final battlegrounds against communism. While involvement led to assistance in the wake of famine and disease, it also shaped Africa's political landscape in a way that left the continent uncertain about its future. The West openly supported sovereignty in nations like Egypt, but as soon as they supported communist China, they pulled funding for the Aswan Dam. The Soviets later stepped in to pick up the pieces. Cases such as this, as well as the Suez Crisis, showed the world that the US relationship with Africa was often one-sided, and the East knew exactly when to turn the tide in their favor. So, while much of America's interest in Africa was fueled by self-interest, what of the Chinese? Well, much like the Romans, for most of recorded history, the only Sino-African or Chinese-African interaction point was far north, primarily Egypt. Scholars have done some extensive digging into potential links between China and Africa predating modern collaboration, but little seems to be known about the subject. The only verifiable connection the two regions had to one another is through the exchange of various commodities, dating as far back as 202 BCE and 220 CE. Trade goods that found their way across the east via the Silk Road. Coins dating back to the Song dynasty have been uncovered by archaeologists in Mogadishu, Kilwa, and Tanzania, as well as discoveries of giraffes, zebras, and incense exported as a novel luxury to the Ming. Yet, these findings were more likely the product of Middle Eastern merchants acting as the middleman link between kingdoms separated by numerous kingdoms, who often interpreted more direct modes of communication between the distant lands as a breach in border security. It is said that in the 14th century, Moroccan traveler and scholar Ibn Battuta made a long journey to Africa and Asia. He reached China in April 1345 after a stay in India, before serving as an envoy of Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq of the Indian Tughlaq dynasty to China. His account of the visit goes as follows. China is the safest, best regulated of countries for a traveler. A man may go by himself on a 9-month journey, carrying with him a large sum of money without any fear. Silk is used for clothing even by poor monks and beggars. Its porcelains are the finest of all makes of pottery, and its hens are bigger than geese in our country. All of this interference would dissipate in the wake of the Cold War. In the late 1950s, when China signed bilateral trade agreements with countries like Algeria, Egypt, and Sudan, figures such as Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai traversed 10 African countries between December 1963 and January 1964. China, quote, began to cultivate ties and offer economic, technical, and military support to African countries and liberation movements in an effort to encourage wars of national liberation and revolution as part of an international united front against both superpowers. The lack of history between China and Africa, contradicting the typical model for diplomatic relations, served as a strength in the following decades. In fact, in the 1970s, there were cases when China aided in the expulsion of Soviet military advisors from Egypt and Sudan with arms and supplies. In many ways, China was an outsider during the Cold War, watching the Soviets and US battle for strongholds and trade. As they became better acquainted with the inner workings of Africa, they chose a diplomatic approach that, at least in recent years, has proven to be much more effective. Much of the way China interacts with countries in Africa stems from their more complicated relations with the US. Ever since the Treaty of Wanchia in 1845, there has been a capitalistic union, albeit by force, between the two nations. Early on, there were signs of a strengthening union, such as the joint effort to quell the anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion. However, after the People's Republic of China rose to power in 1949, along with the exile of the Allied nationalist government to Taiwan, things would prove to be unclear until Nixon's visit in 1972. Since then, China and the United States have acted as polite but distant competitors, sharing interests in the realm of direct commerce like manufacturing, but consistently trying to take the lead when investing in projects abroad. Meetings, such as the recent sit-down with President Biden and Xi, exemplify the lukewarm and often disingenuous displays of affection the two make with one another to prevent a costly conflict between the two parties. As we can now see, this has most recently manifested in the form of a financial Cold War in Africa. And China appears to have found a different recipe to give the states a run for their money. As stated regarding the Chinese-African relationship, there are key factors that separate the US and China diplomatically. Where the US has often subscribed to the British mode of thinking, China preemptively opened relations with Africa from a different angle. Originally, China actually grew close to the anti-apartheid and liberation movements, following the Sino-Soviet split with support for African independence and infrastructure projects. It seemed that wherever the Soviets failed to fulfill their end of the bargain, China would step in and deliver. One example of this would be when Russia shifted support from Somalia to Ethiopia. Somalian President Siad Barre was furious, and China swiftly moved in to support the state with token military aid. Where the US and Soviets would often distance themselves from the complexities of Africa's geopolitical landscape, China has proved to at least partially contribute to seeking resolutions. In fact, in 2016, a declaration of appreciation was signed among 10 separate African nations at the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, thanking the PRC for their effort to solve maritime and territorial disputes. Not only has this hands-on approach proven to be more effective, but some African countries have expressed their gratitude in ways that shocked the Western world. Even as far back as 1971, African nations supported China's entry into the United Nations, and some analysts argue that this support was paramount to this success. When it comes to Taiwan, countries such as Zimbabwe, Sudan, Nigeria, and others have emphasized the importance of the One China policy. At every juncture, China's contribution seems to be reciprocated in any way possible. The Hong Kong protests in 2019 and 2020 saw a similar reaction, prompting Uganda, Tanzania, and Namibia to express their support for the province's absorption. With all of this in mind, some might come to believe that China is acting heroic, but a second look shows all of these motivations are almost strictly financial. This is not to say that this is necessarily wrong, but there are a number of powers around the world that question the ethical nature of Chinese diplomacy. Regardless, none of this criticism seems to be inhibiting the rise of Chinese influence in any meaningful way. As a manufacturing powerhouse, making up almost 30% of global output, the boundless resources found in many African countries make for an almost perfect symbiotic relationship. This becomes clear when looking at some of the recent deals taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. A $126 million smart city surveillance technology project with Huawei as signed by the president of Uganda in recent years. The grip on Ethiopia continues to tighten as well, with about 400 investment projects valued at more than $4 billion. From these deals, China has constructed 70% of the roads, as well as built the highly praised Addis Ababa Railway. Railway construction also took place in Kenya, with the Nairobi-Mombasa Standard Gauge Railway, a $4.7 billion project, with plans for port access and industrial cities to be planted in key cities. In addition to infrastructural projects of unprecedented scale, the Chinese have also moved to put boots on the ground to protect these shared assets. In 2017, China built its first ever overseas military base in Djibouti, which caused a lot of controversy due to their powered lasers injuring neighboring US military aviators sharing the space. In Zambia, in the middle of the COVID-19 outbreak, China was reportedly demanding copper mining assets with a similar level of firepower, as well as seeking to construct a military base in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, on the west coast. According to the Foreign Affairs Committee, at a forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC, in 2000, the Chinese inaugurated a strategic partnership with 44 African governments. Forums have been held every 3 years since. In the most recent meeting in 2018, Beijing pledged $60 billion in economic assistance, matching the previous pledge in 2015. China pledged $40 billion during the 2021 FOCAC. While some committees scaled back from previous years, China promised additional support to combat COVID-19 and announced a goal to increase its imports from Africa to a total of $300 billion in the next 3 years. According to the Chinese Loans to Africa database, Chinese financiers signed 1,188 loan commitments worth $160 billion with African governments and their state-owned enterprises between 2000 and 2020, predominantly in transportation, power generation, mining, and telecommunications. The top loan recipient countries over the last 20 years included Angola, Zambia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Cameroon, and most recently the largest recipients included Ghana, South Africa, and Côte d'Ivoire. This is where the discussion regarding the ethics of this involvement comes into play. To many, China appears to be acting more like an aggressive loan shark in recent years, claiming many of the aforementioned natural resources that make Africa so valuable as collateral for unpaid debts. To put this into perspective, Ethiopia is on the verge of essentially becoming a Chinese vassal state, with its government debt ratio standing at about 60% of its entire GDP. This begs the question, is China at fault for outbidding competitors with lower interest loans, or is it the corruption in African politics that has coincidentally trapped countries into potential all-out servitude to foreign powers? In truth, many historians might be mistaken when they mark the late 20th century as the era of decolonization. If these findings have taught us anything, it's that the interactions between the US, British, and Africa, in contrast to China, are not that different. When the West led the charge for development projects in Africa, taking control of governments was the primary behavior. It's not that loans were not part of the equation, but the efforts made between the 60s and 90s were oriented around the expulsion of communism and the installation of democratic philosophy. In this new climate, China doesn't have a strong desire, at least on the face of it, to control governance in the continent. Instead, the ultimate goal appears to be strictly economical. In return for bridges, you give us your quarry. In return for railways, you give us labor. And so on and so forth. It's not far-fetched to argue that colonization never left the African continent. Quite the contrary. It's more so how colonial rule has manifested. Today, geopolitical analysts call this soft power, choosing to fund and support political initiatives with newly acquired leverage instead of directly involving themselves in the intricacies of individual government bodies. Quote, between 2011 and 2015, under the auspices of the Sino-Africa Political Party Leaders Program, the PRC financed more than 200 young African political leaders. In 2015, the program expanded, with Beijing advertising that it would host 1,000 young African political leaders by 2018. In 2022, the PRC opened its first permanent CCP-funded party school in Africa. It's not too dissimilar to how corporations behave domestically in the United States, pumping their money into legislative goals that serve their respective interests. At the moment, this momentum shows no signs of decline. Politicians across sub-Saharan Africa appear to be enjoying the fruits of Chinese labor. Whether or not one thinks this is an ethical approach, it is clear that the Chinese presence will not be going away anytime soon. That is, as long as the West keeps playing the same game. So, how has the West responded to such developments? Well, when you can't beat them, you get the idea. As China's Belt and Road Initiative has grown to dominate the Central African Copper Belt, along with the final Western stronghold being lost after the Freeport's sale of a major copper mine to China Mali in 2020, Western powers are finally starting to take notice. Locations such as the mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo are becoming more and more important as the world's developed nations attempt to undergo a massive energy transition. Corporations such as Cobalt Metals are striving to turn the tide in locations like Chilelabambwe, receiving around $150 million from outside investors. The US-based company believes that they're sitting on an untapped copper supply capable of powering over 100 million electric vehicles in the coming decades. In order to transport these resources, the US has begun repairing the Benguela Railway, a track connecting Kolwezi to the port of Lobito. It was originally a project funded by the British and Portuguese but was soon utilized by the US in the 1940s to supply operations like the Manhattan Project with the uranium necessary during World War II. After taking a big hit during the Angola Civil War, the railway was out of commission for some time, but China's rise has pushed for its much-needed revival. Western powers have begun to coalesce during the G7 summit to form an economic counterattack against China's Belt and Road. In order to do this, Western powers have since pledged upwards of $600 billion to low-income countries throughout Africa. After talks with Angola and Zambia, the Biden administration is starting to take things a step further, promoting a multilateral effort with the EU and native lands to create a more direct Zambia-Lobito railway that connects directly with the previously mentioned Chilelabambwe mining operation. The project is estimated to cost around $2 billion. That said, these contributions are still dwarfed by what China has invested in the last decade, by over $40 billion, which has caused many to wonder if the West is just posturing in order to appease their respective peoples or to set up a casus belli for what they believe is an inevitable conflict with the PRC. Whatever the case, countries like Zambia are reportedly no longer satisfied with traditional arrangements with the Western world. Originally, resource-rich African countries were more or less satisfied with the arrangement of shipping raw materials overseas in return for military and medical aid. Now, with the Chinese relationship, that is surprisingly green, the continent is full of African leadership that wants more sustainable opportunities for the governments they run and the people they serve. The dynamic found in Africa's political landscape leaves much to be desired, but it appears that many are starting to realize that infrastructure and manufacturing facilities on their home turf will give them the ability to stand on their own 2 feet. All of the aforementioned territories on this 11.73 million square mile landmass have started to understand that a sinister auction is taking place. China is on its way to potentially taking control of a majority of the continent, but Africa, for the first time since stepping onto the world stage, is beginning to at least partially determine its own destiny. Perhaps, in the coming century, the overarching question will become irrelevant, and we'll all be looking at a much more even playing field.